Good morning. So, you know how preachers will sometimes they'll start off with a question, deep theological question, make us all go, Let me do that, get us going. So here it is. Was Indiana Jones devoted to archaeology? What do you think? Everybody going, yeah. Deep Thoughts by John Smith. Was Indiana, I know he wasn't real, it's in a movie, play along, okay? Was Indiana Jones devoted, dedicated to archaeology? We got a yes? Okay. Follow up. How do you know? Because you had your popcorn and you saw the movies, didn't you? He gave evidence, man. It was pretty. He shot a guy over in Egypt or wherever that was in the first one. And I'm not advocating when I say, okay, let's be devoted that we shoot people. Don't. Just keep going with me. Hang in there. But it was not a secret, was it? It was kind of obvious. Because you look at the risks that, in the stories that he would take, the lengths that he would go. He taught on the subject. And he did more than just talk about it in his university classes. He lived it, didn't he? He pursued it all over the world for his whole life. He lived and breathed archaeology. Yeah. And so nobody that was around him at all would go, wait, Professor Jones, he likes archaeology? What? It was there. And did I don't know, you could make a lots of different illustrations, but that's how devotion goes, isn't it? It is something that's translated into life and speech, and it's not a secret. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about being devoted. It's based on this text. This is when Solomon, remember, he's dedicating the temple, and in his prayer, he will include this when he'll say, may your hearts be fully committed. Not just, it's like maybe you've seen this meme on Facebook, but I think it's a good truth. It says, God's not interested in weekend visits. He wants full custody of your heart, of you. And so he says, be fully committed to the Lord our God, to live by his decrees and obey his commands at this time. And he'll even, right there, to tell you what fully devoted involves. Live by the decrees, obedience to the commands. It's not just a sentiment. Well, fully committed doesn't mean just something that goes on here and go, I believe. And then that's it, nothing else. It's like, I believe, comma, then, or thus I will, and follow through is a life. And so we've been looking at full devotion, and here's one more. We defined it over the last 2 weeks. Full devotion involves sacrifice and commitment and a lot of different elements to it. But here it's got deep desire and a complete interest. You got to be all in. And obedience, a relationship, it's not religion. I'm not talking about, I don't know about you, but I'll tell you what, I'll go on the record right now. I am not interested in religion. I don't want it. And I don't believe the New Testament describes religion as might be defined by culture, where it's just ritual and pomp and circumstance, and it's contained by one room in one building for 1 hour in 1 week. And you come in and you start worship and devotion, and then you say amen, and then you stop being devoted until you come in there again that same spot next time. Man, it's so much bigger and better than that. It's relationship. It's an investment of the whole self. Being all in with your heart, soul, strength. Remember, he said, hey, what's the first commandment? They asked Jesus. The biggest and the best one. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength. The whole you. All of the self. See, that's not ritual. That's not religion. That's relationship, man. That is a love affair with God that translates itself into a corresponding lifestyle. Wow. So, like a lot of things, it helps us to illustrate this because people want to know, well, what does that look like, though? And isn't it great to help get examples of people that live that kind of life so that we can look at them and see what it looks like with skin on, in an actual life of an actual person. Because Indiana Jones, okay, yeah, he was devoted, but he's a dude in movies, man. I need real people. Let's talk about one. The epitome of devotion in the Old Testament was David. And so we're going to talk about that. In 2 Chronicles 16:9, it says, "The eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those who are fully committed to him." You can say a lot of things about King David, but that is a description of him. He was, warts and all, fully committed. He was a great example. So we're going to talk about David today. And that among other things, he kind of like the poster child in the Old Testament, at least, of devotion, what devotion looks like. Was he perfect? Oh, no. Far from it. But David was something. And you know that if you take everything that was said about and by David, the things that were written about him and the things he wrote, by far more is said about and by David in the Old Testament than any other character, any other person. I mean, you got huge sections of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st Kings, 1st Chronicles, and the book of Psalms are about or by him. Yeah. So he's a multifaceted person. He wasn't one-dimensional. And it wasn't just one aspect of his life that is featured in Scripture. We see him when he's a young kid taking care of sheep at the bottom of the social strata of the family because he's the youngest. As the youngest of sons in my family, I can relate to David. And personally, as the youngest boy, I loved it when he gets elevated over his brothers to be king. I looked at my brothers like, y'all see that? Yeah, exactly. And but Samuel, the last of the prophets, comes and anoints him as king, and then he's sent back to the sheep. And then later on, here, go take this stuff to your brothers because they're at war, the oldest three. And then we know that David goes, and then there's that whole thing with Goliath. He defeats and beheads Goliath. And then that launches a military career in the service of Saul, the king. And that goes well for a while until it doesn't. And then he will eventually become the King Saul's son-in-law, and he will eventually become a fugitive as Saul, who's kind of messed up in the head. He was paranoid. He was jealous of Saul's growing fame as a soldier. Because, man, it was, when people start singing, dun, 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 here they come, we will rock you, they're coming in back after the battle, and all of a sudden Saul hears them singing, oh yeah, Saul's killed thousands, but David has killed 10,000. Uh-oh. And he's thinking, that guy's going to try to steal the throne from me. And so part of his life, he's a fugitive, running from his own father-in-law who's trying to kill him. And there were times when he was an outlaw, and there was times when he kind of lived as like a bandit for a while. He had different phases in his life. He was a hero to people. He eventually becomes king himself and serves as king for 40 years. A long and storied life. With David, it's, you notice, he is all the way. So when his victories are massive, and so are his failures. He fails as epically as he succeeds in life. And so we want to see some things about him. And it's interesting, when you find out really about some people, sometimes the best way to hear compliments or to give compliments, have you ever noticed, some of the nicest things I ever heard my dad say about me were things that were not said to me. I remember because I was this young, like in junior high one time, and I overheard my dad talking to somebody else about my brother Jeff. My brother Jeff is the oldest, incredibly talented, a 10-talent man. He does, and the things he does with disciple trips, which I'd love to have Jeff, the Lord willing, Jeff will stand here one of these days and tell you about it. but the things that my brother has done and does for the Lord just are world class. And Jeff has always been he was the star athlete, and he was a musician, and he had all the girlfriends, and he was tallest and biggest and coolest and all this stuff. And I always looked up to my brother. I still do. But I remember overhearing my dad. I don't think he even knew I would hear this. And they were talking about how, Jeff is doing this and this and this. And I think I was in 7th grade, maybe 8th grade. And my dad said, well, yeah, he will. He says, but this boy right here someday is going to put him in the shade. I'm looking around going, dude, that was like the greatest day of my life. I was like, really? My dad thinks that? I never knew. And so what I want to focus in like that is what is said about David after he's gone. Because subsequent kings, after David dies, subsequent kings that come along, especially the kings of Judah, after it splits into Israel and Judah, after Solomon dies, many of those kings will be compared to, in their devotion, after they die, they'll be compared to David. David becomes the standard for devotion, for how a king did in God's eyes. And when you become the standard, man, that means something. In 1 Kings 9, this is when I think Solomon is being made king, and it says, as for you, if you walk before me, God is offering the kingship to Solomon. He says, if you'll walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness, look what he says, as David your father did. He's saying, you have a relationship with me like your dad did. You're going to do well. And do all I command and observe decrees and laws. I'll establish your royal throne over Israel forever. Sadly, he doesn't do it. But Solomon says before then, as he's starting out, he's very grateful to be king. He starts well, like a lot of kings did. They start well, but they didn't necessarily always finish well. He started out pretty good, Solomon did. And he says, he's talking to God. He says, you've shown me great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according to, look how he describes David. Look how he's talking about his dad. He said, he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart towards thee. We're going to look at this one verse here at the end again and look at those 3 descriptions of David's devotion. Now, years go by, and Solomon now is an older man. He's been king a long time, and here's a problem. He's not finishing as well as he started, which tells you what? You can't rest on your laurels spiritually. If you were on fire as a young person, you can't tread water now that you're older and think, I can just live off of the devotion I had in my 20s or 30s, and I can hit the coast button. Solomon maybe was thinking that, but this doesn't give us that option. It says, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart, because he had like hundreds of them. He had hundreds of wives, hundreds of concubines. Bad idea. I can't even imagine. It's all I can do to be husband of one. I don't know how you be husband of hundreds of them, but the effect of this was spiritually, they turned his heart away, because a lot of them were wives because they were the daughters of kings he was wanting to make, and this was common for a king, and he might not even knew them or saw them hardly, and because it was political marriages. But the effect was they would bring their gods with the little g with them. They came to live in the harem and in his palace, and they turned his heart away. And look what happened. His heart was not fully devoted. It might have been, his full devotion became something less than that. Part devotion, little devotion, whatever it was. As the heart of David, his father, again, David is the template here. David becomes the standard. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord, did not follow completely like David did. See, David's, for all his problems, he never quit on God. He never gave up. And so he says, when God is getting on to him about this, he says, I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, Molech, the god of the Amorites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, kept my degrees, as David, Solomon's father, did. So I'm going to look about this, go quickly through a couple of, down through the centuries, after Solomon, some of the kings that followed, and how after they're gone, they're compared to the devotion of David. How about Jeroboam that followed? He was the first king of Israel after the split. And he says, God tells him when he's going to make him king, he says, I'll tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, give you 10 tribes because they have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, blah, 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 all these so-called gods, and they have not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight, observing my statutes, my ordinances, as his father David did. Then it will be that if you listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my sight by observing my statutes and my commandments as my servant David did. See how faithful he is? It always points back to David. I'll build you an enduring house. But later on, he has to come back to Jeroboam and say, you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and who followed me. Look at how David did that with all his heart. David was all in all the time, even when he was epically failing, even when he did some horrible mistakes and sins. You go later to a king named Abijam. After he's gone, here's what it says. His heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God like the heart of his father David. And then it says, David did what was right in the sight of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah. And that, that's like the big scandalous, horrible thing that David did with Bathsheba. Had an affair with a wife of one of his soldiers and then murdered the guy to try to cover it up. And Nathan the prophet comes and he says, you did that. And now Asa was another king that followed later on, and afterwards, after Asa's gone, it says Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord. And again, he's compared with, his devotion is compared to David's, like David his father. The high places it says about him were not taken down. He didn't do all that he should have done as king, but nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly devoted to the Lord all of his days, like David there. Jehu comes along later on. After Jehu's gone, here's what it says about him. The commentary says this in the scriptures. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord of Israel with all his heart, unlike David. Amaziah was a king, and it says after he died, he did right in the sight of the Lord, yet not like David his father. Ahaz was king later on, and after Ahaz is gone, he was 20 years old and became king, and then later it'll say he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God, as his father David had done. See how they're all compared to David after they're gone. Hezekiah was a good king, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord and all that his father had done. And then Josiah became king in his youth, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in all the way of his father David. So they're always compared to David. What is it about David, man? Well, we go back to 1 Kings 3, verse 6 that we read earlier, where he says, when he's told that, talking to God, thou hast shown great loving kindness to thy servant David, my father. This is, these words are spoken by Solomon, according to all he has walked before thee in truth. So he's going to give us kind of three ingredients, three elements in this verse of what it means to be devoted, as far as the kind of devotion that David shows us and exemplifies to us. First of all, David walked in truth. And what does it mean to walk in truth? Oh, it's pretty simple. It's living up to a God-shaped standard. Everybody walks according to some standard, kind of what rules your steps, what kind of guides the way you live and why you do what you do. Not everybody recognizes that or even admits to it, but everybody's got a standard of something. It may be, but the problem is, whose standard is it and where does it come from? And David was sure to get a God-shaped standard by going according to what God's will and word was for him. That's not always easy, is it? But it's always better. It's always right. It won't always be agreed with or liked or get you, kudos from people. It's always better. It means living in authenticity. It says you got to be genuine. It's got to be real. You can't manufacture this or fake it. It's got to be the real deal. You got to be really, God can see through us And we're not going to fool him. We can, and maybe we'll fool ourselves. We won't fool the Lord. You got to be authentic. And you got to live and believe according to God's authority. You submit yourselves to his standard. And it says, he lived by the word. And the Bible says in John 17, his word is truth. So if I'm not going according to the scriptures, I won't have the kind of devotion that David did. And second thing he says in that verse, 1 Kings 3:6, about David's devotion is that not only he walked before God in truth, he says, and righteousness. He walked in righteousness, or you could kind of cut that in half where it say rightness, being in a right state with God. What does that mean? To walk in righteousness means living a godly lifestyle. This is where you kind of, it's not just theoretical. This is how you live. And Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy, he says, watch your life and your doctrine closely. You got to pay attention to that. Those need to be correct, both of those. And for the most part, David pursued this, didn't it? Now, did he mess up a couple times? Did he mess up some just world-class sins and mistakes? Absolutely. And but his intention, his desire, his deep, deep, heartfelt desire, as is expressed over and over again in the book of Psalms, when he wrote those, was to live according to God's plan. It was a God-ruled living. That everybody is ruled by something and someone. And a lot of people think, not me. Nobody's over me. And it's like, okay, then your God is you. That's still somebody over you. And of course, you're fooling yourself to believe that. But everybody's living under somebody's rule. You're in somebody's kingdom. The question is whose and why, and what will the result of that be? And look at Philippians 1:20. When Paul talked about who ruled him, he said in Philippians 20, according to my earnest expectation and hope that I shall not be put to shame in anything, but that with all boldness Christ shall even now, as always, be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Yeah. And then the third thing we see in devotion is that, as again, back to our verse, 1 Kings 3:6, he not only walked in truth, he not only walked in righteousness, David walked in uprightness of heart toward God. That was the third element there. What does it mean to walk in uprightness of heart? It means to be all in. Right there in the very next verse to one that I just read in Philippians 1:21, Paul will say, so to live, he said, for me, Paul says, to live is Christ. That's what life is. That's how you define life. And that's not only how the definition of life, that's the contents. That's the substance of what life is. And he was fully engaged, the whole self, like we're taught to love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. We don't parcel that out. We don't give God the leftovers or the crumbs as if that would be enough, as if he deserved only a part of me. We don't give God Sunday and then say, the rest of the time, that's mine. We just put ourselves totally in subjection to him, and he sends us out to do and to serve. It means a pure heart. A pure heart will look at things differently, won't they? And then correspondingly live that. Remember what Jesus said in Sermon on the Mount? The Beatitudes, blessed are the pure in heart. Psalm 24, verse 3 and 4 will describe that. And that has to do with motive as well. Motive, Jesus, if you'll notice in a lot of his teaching, he talks a lot about motive. Not just what you do, but why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Remember, of course, he'd use the Pharisees and how they pray. He says, the Pharisees love to pray. Those are some religious people. The Pharisees are a lot of the reason I don't want to be religious. I want to be righteous. And it's not the same thing. I don't want to just have religion. I want to have relationship. Not the same thing. Pharisees were really good at being and looking and sounding really religious. They didn't have a relationship. They weren't righteous. He said, oh, they pray all the time. But remember what he said about how they pray? They love the street corner. They love it where it's public and you can see and hear. And they make this big to-do about their prayers. And they make sure that you can hear it. And they make sure that you can, and they go on with all these repetitive things and all of this elaborate, over-the-top, fancy speech to impress not God, but you. So that you go, oh, wow, you're so spiritual. And he says, oh, they get their applause from men, but that's it. God is up there going, really? Who are you trying to please? So motive matters with God. And so we've got to monitor our motives, don't we? If we want to be wholly devoted, you may have to ask yourself some hard questions. You may have to look in a mirror and use the scriptures as a mirror and have the courage, pray for the courage to hold that mirror up and go, because there may be some skeletons in our spiritual closets we'd rather not admit that are there. And we may have some motives that are not pure or what they should be. We've got to confront that and seek God's help to make them right. Man, David did some horrible stuff, didn't he? That thing with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite, that was messed up. But the difference between when he sinned and was confronted versus when King Saul sinned and was confronted, if you remember, Samuel got up in Saul's grill and said, what are you doing? When he was really messing up, he's like, no, it was the army, man. They made me, and he's making excuses. He's justifying himself. He's like, no, I did what you said, even though he said, well, I did part of it, so that'd be good enough, right? Versus David, Nathan gets up in his face, what have you done? And he's like, oh, no. And he is instantly contrite and repentant and confesses it. Read Psalm 51. That is the psalm written by David in the immediate aftermath of that affair, expressing his brokenness and his repentance. Sometimes when you're broken and messed up and if you don't know how to articulate that to God, if you want, you can use Psalm 51 as a help to pour it out to God going, did it again, I'm epic fail, that's me. Monitor our motives. So the devotion of David. Here's what we see with David. David was complicated. He's a multifaceted guy. Some people think that he was just this big soldier, so he would have been this blunt object. He would have just been some Rambo, killing Philistines, and that was all it was. But no. He had a deep heart. He had hardness in him and softness in him. He was a poet. He's like this poet, Rambo, warrior king. Almost parts of him seemingly contradict with others, but he's a multifaceted guy. And he made a lot of mistakes, and he was a faulty, sinful man. But he was deeply, deeply loyal, wasn't he? He was loyal to his king. He's still loyal to the king that's trying to kill him while he's trying to kill him. He's like, don't you, that's God's anointed. His men said, let's take him right now. We could kill him. In the cave when he's sleeping, don't you lay a hand on God's anointed. That guy's trying to murder you. Yes, but I will not murder him. He's loyal to the king. He's loyal to family and friends, his relationship with his best friend Jonathan, and to others in his lives. He didn't sell him out. He didn't stab him in the back. He didn't even when some of them did to him. When he was on the run from his son, and some of his that had been his friends are pelting rocks and cursing him and all that. And the friend of David, as they're leaving town, said, can I go up and kill that man? He said, no, leave him alone. Maybe, who knows, that God maybe sent him to do that. But he was especially loyal to God, above and beyond anything else, no matter what. He wasn't just loyal to God when things were going great and he's the king and everybody's like, whoa, you're the king. He was still loyal to God just as much when everything had fallen apart and he is totally messed up and he's totally choked, still loyal. That's what we learn from David. That's why we need his example. It's like, because There are some days when I'm on top of the mountain, right? Yeah, everything's going good. And there's days when the mountain is on top of me. And everything is wrong, man, and messed up. Life happens. So that's what we learned. Through all his trials and successes, failures, struggles, victories, all of it, he never quit on God. Never gave him less than all of his heart, all of his commitment. God honored that. God knew and saw that. God sees and knows that. Doesn't make his sins okay. It didn't make his mistakes not wrong. But God was willing and able to forgive and restore him just like us, warts and all. So here's a sample as we end. David wrote this. There's just a million of these in the Psalms of David. But here's a few words of his that just illustrate his devotion. Vindicate me. Because he was under the run and under the gun so often in his life. And he says, so I've led a blameless life. That mean perfect, sinless? Nope. But I've trusted in the Lord without wavering. Test me, and O Lord, and try me. Examine my heart. Are we willing to pray that? And my mind. For your love is ever before me, and I walk continually in your truth. Do we? I love the house where you live, oh God. He's not just mildly interested. I love God's house. The place where your glory dwells. And on and on it goes. Read about what David wrote and see what devotion sounds like. Now, David was devoted. And so next week I want to look at just quickly through a series of other Old Testament characters to show us their type of devotion. You'll notice that the way that the devotion is expressed is not all the same. It's not some cookie cutter approach, because our lives aren't all the same, are they? But you'll see that devotion, there is a devotion that cuts through all of those lives. And then 2 weeks from today, we'll look at some New Testament examples. We're going to look at later a devotion in the desert. What about when things are hard? When you're in emotional or a spiritual or a situational desert, as everybody goes through at various times in life. Can you be devoted even then? And then finally, we'll finish up with a devoted church as we look at the church in the book of Acts and see their devotion. And we can learn from all of these folks and apply that to our relationship with Jesus. Let it be so. Let us follow the lead of the devotion of David. Not in his mistakes, but in his unwillingness to give an inch, to back off even when he has done wrong. He never took his foot off the gas of devotion. In the good times and the bad, no matter what, that's what devotion does. The kind of devotion God seeks and rewards and helps with even today. Let it be so. While together we stand and sing. Jesus, I surrender all to him.